Hi, this is Phil Cooke, and welcome to today's episode. It's interesting. We always think about publicity for projects. If you're a filmmaker, if you're a writer, if you're a leader of a nonprofit, a pastor, a business person, we constantly think about how can we get the word out about what we do. Then there's the negative side, which is crisis PR. What happens if a crisis happens? And Lord, we've seen so many crises in the business world, in the ministry world, the nonprofit world in the last year or two. So there's a lot of issues when it comes to media coverage of you or your project, your book, whatever. So today I got Larry Ross. He's the founder of Larry Ross Communications in Dallas. He goes way, way back, his long career. We've known each other for many, many years. We're scuba diving buddies. But more importantly, he's been representing people from Billy Graham to Rick Warren and many, many others out there, getting their story in the national media. And I think you can learn a lot from today's episode on how to get your story told in the media. So I'm thrilled today to be with my longtime friend, Larry Ross, who is the founder of Larry Ross Communications based in Dallas. Larry, welcome to the podcast today.
Thanks, Phil. Good to be with you, brother.
We go back a number of years. We've been scuba diving together. We've traveled around the world together. But I think the first time I ever knew about you was when you were running media for Billy Graham way back in the Crusade days. I was producing, it may have been in Essen, Germany or San Juan, Puerto Rico, one of those global satellite events. But I just remember watching you in action, dealing with this massive amount of media at this huge global conference and crusade that Billy had. You were with them for a long time.
Well, I was privileged to serve as Mr. Graham's personal media spokesperson for nearly 35 years.
Wow.
And since then, I've been working at the intersection of faith and culture, actually for over 4 decades, helping Christian leaders like Mr. Graham, Rick Warren, and others we've represented to tell their story to and through the media. And of course, in the last 10 years, direct through social media. And So it's been a blessing. It was kind of my life's work in the last 10 years of his life, helping to codify his legacy. And I don't think we'll see another one like him in our lifetime, Phil.
That's true. That's true. So you've worked with a number of major ministry organizations. Tell me about public relations. What does that have to do with ministry? How does that all work? What does public relations really mean today?
The reality is, just as you are not a Christian filmmaker or television producer, neither am I a Christian public relations practitioner. We are communications professionals who happen to be believers, and our faith informs our work. And as such, we have a higher bar. We're called to excellence, obviously, in the body of Christ. We pursue best practices. In fact, we have a strike against us. When people hear that we're Christian, they expect inferior work. So we have to do better than our peers out in the world. And yet, I think because our faith informs our work, it adds I've never been called to preach. I don't know about you, but
no.
I believe that what I do is every bit as much ministry as we are helping Christian leaders like Billy Graham and Rick Warren extend their influence to and through the media and the impact of their organizations, their churches, and reaching people that would never otherwise come within the sound of their voice or be impacted by their ministry. So it's been a blessing these many years to do that. I started out my career with a nonprofit in Chicago right out of college in the mid-'70s. Then I went to work for the General Motors Corporation. I was on the road traveling, representing them for 2 years. And in the early 80s, was hired by the 8th largest PR firm working in New York. And my client was Joe DiMaggio. He was spokesperson for the Bowery Savings Bank. And we'd bring him into New York a couple times a month and put a rhinestone collar on him and trot him around. So I went in 81 from a sports icon to a faith icon. And have just been at the intersection of faith and culture, providing crossover communications on behalf of clients ever since.
So what does that exactly mean? When you talk about handling media for a client or public relations for a client, most church leaders, nonprofit leaders don't really understand how that world works. And particularly in today's world where we're being bombarded with media messages from everywhere. Why does it matter in a ministry setting?
Well, first of all, unlike perhaps our counterparts in the secular world working for celebrities and all, we don't manufacture an image for our clients. We project an identity that already exists. And in the case of Mr. Graham, we represent him personally. Whenever you saw him on Good Morning America or Today shows, we were interfacing on his behalf. We'd have the crusades. We'd have a press operation, help the media get the story. Let me give you one example how this works. Back in the early 90s, I think it was, Mr. Graham had a crusade at the Meadowlands in New Jersey, where the Giants play, or the Giants, I guess. And so we were at the arena there, and on the first night of the crusade, he announced he was preaching on his most oft-requested topic, loneliness. New York City, you can be lonely in a crowd of 20 million people. Yeah. So I called the religion editor of it was then the Bergen Record, it's now the Record, and said, hey, why don't you come out and do a story on Mr. Graham's sermon Thursday night? Sure enough, he did. Front page the next day, big chunks of Mr. Graham's sermon. And a young man who had never been to church a day in his life, but was lonely, read that, and he said, hey, that's me. He pulled out the yellow pages, found the closest church to his home, called, and asked to speak to the pastor, who happened to be a counseling supervisor at the crusade. They chatted for an hour, and then that pastor led that young man to the Lord. So that newspaper became a Billy Graham crusade for that young man. Never would have been impacted in any other way had it not been for the media coverage of that event. So one of the things that really is fulfilling to me, Phil, through the years, has been to place a positive story about faith in a media that is not predisposed, might even be hostile to religion. And so what we do is we try to help put the gospel in a cultural context. And we try to emphasize things that don't require a reporter to be of like-minded faith to see it as news in the context of traditional news values that their audience needs. And so one of the mistakes I think many ministries make, or churches even, is they go hat in hand to the media and say, we're doing a good work. Will you promote our organization or publicize our event? The reality is, whether you're Billy Graham or Brother Wonderful from First Church, the media could give a flying flip about what you're doing. They care about one thing, and that's creating a quality program or publication that's of interest to or relevance to their audience. So we go to them and say, I've got something of interest to your audience, and here's why, and try to find some common ground whereby they can then report on what our clients are doing or saying. But here's the other thing, Phil. I remember years ago talking to the head booker at CNN. At the time, she had 20 people on her team booking every day part, except for, at the time, it was Larry King at night and American Morning in the morning. And I said, Maria, how can we as PR people help you and your team do their job? She said, Larry, I know you want us to cover things your clients are doing and saying, but really the easiest thing is for you to bring people to us who can speak in the stories we're already covering, who can be authoritative resources, source experts, if you will, on a various topics. So if you're a pastor out there and you think, man, I don't know anything about media, start with your local media, get to know them, invite them to lunch, even when you don't want to do a story, that they understand what you're doing. And they might see you as a source expert on a local story if there's a COVID story or if there's a plane crash or death or grief or whatever. And you might be able to speak into that story and in the process give an account for the hope that's within you, as we're called to do.
So along that line, I remember Jack Hayford was my pastor for 20 some years. We raised our daughters in his church. And I remember Jack saying early in his ministry, when he just started Church on the Way, he called up the religion editor for the Los Angeles Times and offered to take him to lunch. He took him to lunch one day and he said, look, I know you're being bombarded with stories on religion. There's just a lot of stuff out there in a city the size of LA. You don't have a big staff. I'm happy to put my staff at your disposal. If you ever need any research, anything some help in that area, I'm happy to help whatever I can do. And it's interesting that over those 20 some years since then, they probably interviewed Jack Hayford in the LA Times more than any other single person, simply because Jack reached out and was generous to them. And I think that's a really good lesson in exactly what you're talking about. It's how do you help those guys, because they're doing stories, they're flooded with ideas and things they need to do.
Absolutely.
And so I think that really does make a big difference.
Well, for 7 years, we had a colleague who was the former news director at the CBS station here. He came over to the dark side, the PR side, for a couple of years, and then went back, and he's now the news director at that station. And he has a Rolodex. Do people use Rolodex? I don't know. It's in his iPhone, but he has his contact list. And when he needs a person of faith, if there's a story about some denomination making a vote or whatever the story is, he needs a pastor. He starts dialing the first one who's available and says, yes, they're in. And so if they know you, you're on their radar. You can even send a press kit that has background. They put it in the file. But the key is these folks have to have a story go on the news that night, and you can't wait. And so if you're available, what the beauty of now post-COVID, Phil, as you know, and by the way, if I could just press pause and say, it was just over a year ago that you were prophetic, brother. You and I had a conversation. You said, Larry, I think COVID is here to stay. We need to get these churches online doing digital church. Do you remember that conversation?
Yeah, I do.
And you were the Pied Piper that led people and helped them to do that. In fact, I was reading this week in Amos, I think it's Amos 4:3, where the Lord says, behold, I will send a famine in the land, but it won't be for food and water. It will be thirst for the hearing the word of God. Wow. And I really think that we have seen that happen in COVID, that there has been an unprecedented search for purpose and meaning. People are afraid. They're looking to turn that fear into faith. And the churches that have been scratching that itch and really addressing some of those felt needs are the ones that are really resonating. And I know this has been true of your clients. Our clients are averaging 3 or 4 times as many people online as we're coming to church. I don't know what the new normal will be, but I think it's going to be better, because in this time we stopped taking things for granted and we got serious about what's important. And so I thank you for what you're doing with in the medium of film. In fact, other than working with Billy Graham, one of the most fulfilling things in my career has been to work on some of these great movie projects. Working with Mel Gibson and The Passion of the Christ, for example, I think we worked together somewhat on that. Because anymore, I forget who it was that said, filmmakers are the new high priests of our culture. If you go by a Cineplex on 11 on Sunday morning, the parking lot's full, or it was before COVID. That's where people go to church. That's where values are formed. All
right, so let's get down to nitty-gritty stuff here for a minute. At the start of your career, my career, a lot of news outlets, a lot of media organizations had religion editors. You don't see that so much today. So if I'm a pastor, particularly in a smaller town or in a medium-sized market, what do I do to reach out to media people? I mean, I've sent a ton of clients to you for help, but if I'm a smaller pastor and I just try to get our event covered or something, trying to reach out to the media, give me some tips for how I could start doing that.
Well, it's true. Dallas Morning News for years had an award-winning religion section. It was 12 or 16 pages every Saturday.
Wow.
And they furloughed all the religion writers. They don't have it anymore. They basically cover religion by syndicated stories from Religion News Service, which is like an AP for religion. However, if you open up a newspaper, there are many stories that relate to faith. I remember Gus Niebuhr, the former religion editor of the New York Times years ago, once said famously that religion intersects every aspect of life. And so the way to get a faith story is to determine where faith intersects with science, masks, and COVID, okay? Where does faith come into that? Where faith comes into, why does God allow bad, or why does God allow bad things to happen to good people? Whatever it is.
Yeah.
And so there's always a way to speak into a story, and some reporters understand it better than others. That's why we've been blessed to work as a third-party agency, helping pastors know who to call and where some of these platforms that would be amenable to a message like that. But here's my recommendation, other than just getting to know the media in your area, is don't forget the power of a well-placed op-ed, which is stands for the opposite of the editorial page. It's the guest editorials that every newspaper runs every day. And if you have a burning thought or a unique angle on a story that the media are already covering, they're open to editorial submissions. You don't necessarily have to write it first. Just write them a letter and say, here's what I'd like to pitch. And if they say, go for it, we'll see that. We'll take a look at it. Here's the key to it, though. You can't just rehash what's already happened. You have to advance the conversation.
Yes.
Normally, it means mounting the stake on some position and say, okay, here's what I believe. And then they'll find someone else who has a differing opinion, and it's game on. And, but it creates an interesting dialogue and conversation. So, or same thing is true for an interview in the local station. If they know that you're a source, they'll come out, send a crew to your church or wherever, and speak into whatever story they're already covering, if there's a faith component to it.
That's a good word. And I always encourage leaders to, what is that one big thing, that niche, that area of expertise that you have? That's the thing that can really be the bar that pries open that door. So I get calls when, controversial movies come out. I remember in the days of the Da Vinci Code or the more recent Noah movie and other movies that have come out since. I get a lot of calls, what is the Christian perspective on this? What do you think about this? And so finding that area of expertise, I think, is really, really critical.
Here's the thing. It used to be people say, well, can you get us on Larry King or Oprah? And I would say, well, respectfully, Pastor, have you ever done an interview? No, but I think God's calling me to get on Oprah. And it's well, let's crawl before we walk or run. But now you can, because everything is searchable, you can start with the local interview. You can do a blog and somebody sees it and says, hey, that's a perspective we want to cover. You may get a call. They may have you on their show. So that's how it works. All this is intertwined. And but even if you have to start small, the key is we were interviewing a gal a couple of years ago for a position, and she said something I'll never forget. She said, everybody gets enamored with the emerging new mediums, social media and all that. But she said, really, the primary, the most important thing is the message. These are like my term, new wineskins. There's always a new wineskin that you can put the message in, but it's the message that carries the day. The first thing a publisher looks at is what kind of a digital footprint you have. So if a prospective author out there, particularly for a first-time author, my encouragement would be to start building your digital footprint, your social media followers.
It's funny when I write a book, one of my books, I got on the Today Show. I can get on tons of, television programs and radio stations. In between books, I couldn't get an interview if I held a gun to people's heads. But books are something I think they must give. I don't know. You tell me. It's like they give reporters something to talk about, something to ask you about. So I've just found having a book or a major project that you're launching, something that they can talk about, is a real key to getting some interview time.
It is. And for whatever reason, I still don't understand it, but it does validate you as whatever. I'm an author. Okay. Television producer, film producer, author. Oh, okay. Let's talk to the author of Phil Cooke.
Yeah.
But, where we first saw this, how important this was Steve Martin in The Jerk, where it starts out where he runs out to the van and says, and he pulls a phone book out and he finds his name and he goes, the new phone book's here. I am somebody.
Somebody.
So writing a book makes you somebody.
That's true. So let's go to the dark side for a minute. You spend a lot of your time helping get stories out there, helping get publicity for clients. What about crisis communications? I tend to tell people in today's digital age, it's not if a crisis will happen, it's when a crisis will happen. And we should always be ready for, someone on our team to screw up, somebody in our church to abscond with money, somebody to have an affair. Sure. We've seen so many leaders just in the last year or two just crash and burn because of this. Every church, I believe, every nonprofit organization, ministry needs to understand that it could happen. What are some tips? What do we need to be thinking about when it comes to telling our story in a crisis?
Well, it's true. Every organization is either coming out of a crisis, in a crisis, or is going to have a crisis. Crises happen. They just do. Crisis communications, crisis management is planned. And as you said, you need to be prepared. And we do a lot of that, doing an audit for organizations and say, okay, here are 15 scenarios that, if you're a church, plan, maybe a shooting. Hope it doesn't happen. It might. It does happen. Moral failure, whatever it is. And then who are the audiences and what are the concentric circles to whom you need to communicate? When a crisis hits, there are three questions that are first asked. What did you know? When did you know it? And what did you do about it? Acting swiftly is key. And transparency. If there's abuse, it's very important to show pastoral care and concern primarily to the victims. First and foremost is offering counseling, prayer, and whatever, calling for victims, whatever can be done to show. And granted, it may be the church itself is a victim, whatever. But as long as there are guidelines in place, if the guidelines weren't strong enough, then reviewing those guidelines, bringing in outside experts to do that, showing what you're doing to make sure this doesn't happen again. That transparency is key, and people will understand that. They'll be grateful for it, particularly if in a church situation. And of course, if it is a situation that involves abuse, it's very important, the mandatory reporting, which,
Yes.
10, 20 years ago, it wasn't taken as seriously. It's very important now, as you know. But there are other, you look at COVID, that's a disaster. People have handled it in different ways. Some were ready, some not. But crisis communications deals with the second reality in any situation, what people think happened. It's not dealing with the facts. It deals with the perception of what happened. And that gets fueled often by social media. The problem is, with social media and the drums start beating, people get into an emotional response, and the knee-jerk, the default for the board or whatever is to just have a knee-jerk response. I think I would encourage any organizational leadership to forego short-term expediency and focus on long-term viability. You may have to ride it out for a couple of days until the facts are known, but you want to deal in facts, not emotions, and trying to help set the record straight. The key is that you want to be in charge of crisis communications can help mitigate risk and help you to self-identify rather than be defined by others. Yeah. And I think that's the problem, is people get reactive. You want to release bad information. You want to act swiftly, stay ahead of bad news, and keep people informed rather than having to react.
That's
and
good.
Also, I think
no, I'm just going to say, I'm just tagging on to what you just said. I always tell people, do you want your story out there, or do you want to live the rest of your life at the mercy of everybody else's version of that story? So I do think you're exactly right. You need to get now. I always tell my clients to be honest, but you don't have to tell everything. I find people also get in trouble when they talk too much about something. It
doesn't mean full disclosure. You're right.
Yes.
Yeah. And here's the biggest problem, Phil. When it's a crisis that involves personnel, HIPAA laws and employment laws kick in, and you can't say anything. If it's an employment situation, if it's moral failure or something involving an employee, the people can talk about it, but there's very limited information that can be made publicly just because of the laws in place around that. And sometimes insurance is involved. You have to, whatever your insurance company will allow. If there's a breach of a church or an organization's computer system or what have you, there are all kinds of things that kick in. So the key is to have a kind of a preemptive plan in place. We call it a message action plan, a MAP, and identify a team who is going to be kind of in the war room if we have to assemble and pull it out of the file. Let's see where, what we had planned we'll do if something like this hits. You have to identify who your spokesperson is. We rarely recommend, every situation is different, that people do TV interviews or whatever. Let's say it's something happening in a church. Usually a per inquiry statement. Have a statement that can be issued on a per inquiry basis. You never want to broadcast to narrowcast, because you end up, by trying to clarify, you end up introducing a whole lot more, a larger audience to a story they never heard of in the first place. So you want to stay with media-specific response.
Now, you mentioned spokesperson. I know you were spokesperson for Billy Graham for many years. You've done it for Rick Warren and others. That means, I assume, that the pastor or the nonprofit leader shouldn't always necessarily be the spokesperson. You could have somebody else actually dealing with a crisis who might be maybe a little more level-headed, less emotional, a little more objective. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, yes, we often recommend it not be the pastor. Let the pastor stay above the fray. I mean, don't forget, a crisis often is something negative. So whether it's the executive pastor, whether it's the chair of the board of elders, what have you, it may not even be that individual. It may be the elder board or whatever making a statement. Let the pastor focus on ministry. And I think that here's the thing that really I think is important to look at. A crisis doesn't necessarily have to be bad. It has a certain degree of risk and uncertainty. But the Chinese word for crisis is made up of two symbols that I don't speak Chinese, but I just know this from researching this: danger and opportunity. So every crisis has danger, of course, but there's always an opportunity to reframe the picture and to project who you really are. Now, here's the thing. It's axiomatic that there's a PR axiom that says it's not that people don't know so much, but that they know so much that ain't so. And I can't tell you how much time we spend, Phil, reframing the picture on the ain't so. And so the people who know the least about something have the most definite opinion about something, as you know. And so I think that helping to message that, but leave the pastor to be there for being the pastor rather than having to be trying to sort out a problem that will hopefully go away in a short period of time.
I've also noticed that, the thing you have to think about, too, is that reporters are professional. These guys know what they're doing. And so a lot of pastors, a lot of nonprofit leaders, ministry leaders just assume they can go in there and take control of the situation and handle that reporter. Well, a reporter spends his life getting information out of people. So very often I've seen leaders humiliated because they thought they could handle an interview, which in truth they could not. So I do believe, I love your thought. Have a professional, someone that's level-headed, have somebody that knows how to deal with the situation, go in there. And if you have to do an interview at all, and I don't think, tell me if I'm wrong, but I advise clients, you don't have to respond to every reporter who calls. You don't have to. There's nothing that says you have to go out in front of the media, right?
That's true. Well, in fact, many times they're fishing. They have various techniques. We do a lot of spokesperson training, how to say what you want to say rather than what you're being set up to say. And so the reporters that's their job. And in fact, I will say this, and I need to say up front, I've been grateful for a wonderful relationship with the media, with individuals in the media, but overall with the media, Mr. Graham and other clients. But the reality is, one of the times that are changing is the role of media is changing. They no longer report the news. They operate out of narrative. There's a story they want to tell, and they're going to go find sources that help tell that story. And so if whatever you say fits the narrative, then you're in. If not, then they'll go somewhere else. So I think it's important to know what you're dealing with there. And even, when someone says a religion reporter, they may or may not be a person of faith. And yet when you get general assignment reporters, half the time this may be the first religion story. They don't go to church or know anyone who does. And they think an epistle is the life of an apostle, and so we have to be the things that you would normally be implicit about. You almost have to be explicit, explaining terms. True. And that's one of the things I think that, don't forget, Phil, as people of faith, we're no longer the home team. I mean, culture has changed. The prevailing winds of culture go against the Christian worldview. And so it's increasingly challenging to stay the course and tell your story in a way that is understood by the media. And yet it provides an opportunity to give an account of the hope that's within you and do it in a way that, for us, it's not transactional, it's transformational. And yet much of the time it's an education challenge as much as an information challenge. And I think that a big part of helping organizations either coming out of COVID or whatever is establishing their brand identity is to talk about the why. It's not what you do, but why you do it. And sometimes it's that why that really is the compelling narrative that's different from anybody else that they're interviewing.
That's really good. Well, I think the lesson in all this is the media is there. There are amazing opportunities to get your story out. I mean, the Great Commission is all about getting the gospel story out there. And I don't think, trying to generate publicity for a project is not about ego. It's really about getting that story out there. So I think pastors, nonprofit leaders, ministry leaders, I just encourage them. If you're listening, watching right now, I'd really encourage you to know who the media players are in your community. If you're in Columbus, Ohio, or Atlanta, or Dallas, or LA, or wherever, know who the media players are, who's most likely to cover their religion stories, and reach out to them. And if you, just like Larry says, if you can kind of dovetail your story with a story that's happening in the media right now, the chances are so much greater that you'll get coverage and you'll be able to speak into that story on those media platforms. So Larry Ross Communications, how do we get in touch with you? We want publicity for a book, or I'm going through a crisis, or I would just like to speak into some story out there and I need some help. How do we get in touch with you?
Well, thanks, Phil. My name again is Larry Ross. It's initial A, Larry Ross Communications. That's www.alarryross.com. And
cool.
My email is my initials, ALR@alarryross.com. And I'm on Twitter and Facebook and Instagram. And so happy to talk with anyone if they have any needs. By the way, Phil, I have to say, I know I'm way behind you, but I'm like the cobbler's kids who have no shoes. I'm too busy doing everybody else's stuff, but I'm finally writing my own book.
Oh,
my first book. Yeah, I've got the page numbers done. I'm up to about 500 now. I'm feeling pretty good about it. No writer's block here, brother.
Perfect. Now, hold a second. On a serious note, you mentioned media training. You guys do media training. So if somebody wants to be more comfortable on camera or in front of a reporter, that's something you teach?
Absolutely do. We use what we call spokesperson training. We half day, full day. We can do it by Zoom, whatever. But helping to go through the paces, both some theoretical training as well as some hands-on practical training. Understanding some of the techniques that reporters use, helping to look at an interview as conversation, not confrontation.
Well, thanks for being here. I'm gonna tell people that I highly recommend Larry and his team. He's got a fantastic team that works with him. And whether you need public relations help, or you're just dealing with some project that you want to get word out about it, or you've got a book or some other movie or something like that you need to tell that story, Larry's the guy to talk to. He's spent his whole career getting to know network television and radio people, magazine people, just all kinds of media people out there. And he knows the relationships and who to call to tell that story in the right way. So I'd encourage you to give him a call. Larry, thanks a lot for being here. Just as a reminder, I wrote my book, Maximize Your Influence, How to Make Digital Media Work for Your Church, Your Ministry, and You. And there's an entire section in here on public relations, crisis PR, dealing with those kind of things. So I highly recommend you talk to a professional like Larry. But in the meantime, you need to get the background so that when you talk to someone, you know what you're talking about, you know the objectives you need to be seeking. Those kind of things are vitally important. So this book was meant to be a reference. Maximize Your Influence. Go to my website, philcooke.com. You can also find it at barnesandnoble.com, Amazon, wherever books are sold. You can get a copy of it. It'll really give you the kind of background you need and take you to the next level when it comes to communications, telling your story, what to do in a crisis, those kind of things. Thanks so much for listening in. And if you know someone going through a crisis like this, somebody looking for positive publicity, share this episode with them and always give us a rating. It really makes a big difference. And we appreciate you thinking enough about these episodes to share them with friends. In the meantime, I'll see you next time.